Picture this: a single woman's face launching 1,000 warships across the wine-dark sea. A 10-year war that would echo through history. A wooden horse that would bring down the mightiest fortress in the ancient world. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about the Trojan War is completely wrong? For over a century, archaeologists have been digging through the ruins of ancient Troy, and what they've found will shock you. The war wasn't fought the way Homer described it. The heroes might have been real people, and the most famous trick in military history, the Trojan Horse, might actually have happened. But before we get to that mind-blowing revelation, we need to understand why this war started in the first place. And trust me, it wasn't just about Helen's beauty. Chapter 1. The city that shouldn't have existed. The story begins with a city that shouldn't have existed. Troy sat at one of the most dangerous locations on Earth, right where Europe meets Asia, where two massive empires would clash for centuries. This wasn't some random choice by ancient city planners. Troy's location was both its greatest strength and its fatal weakness. But to understand why Troy became the target of history's most famous war, we need to go back even further, to the very beginning of civilization itself. Around 3500 BC, when most of Europe was still populated by Stone Age hunters, the people of the Eastern Mediterranean were already building cities, developing writing systems, and creating the world's first international trade networks. The Bronze Age didn't just give us better weapons and tools, it created the world's first global economy. For the first time in human history, raw materials from one corner of the world were being shipped thousands of miles to craftsmen in another corner. Tin from Afghanistan would be combined with copper from Cyprus to create bronze weapons in workshops from Egypt to Greece. Amber from the Baltic Sea found its way to tombs in Mycenae. Silk from China reached the palaces of Mesopotamian kings. But here's the crucial thing about this ancient global economy. It was incredibly fragile. Unlike today's world, where goods can travel by land, air, or sea, Bronze Age trade was almost entirely dependent on shipping. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, almost all of that shipping had to pass through one narrow choke point, the Dardanelles, the thin strip of water that connects the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. Imagine standing on the walls of ancient Troy around 1200 BC. You're looking out over the Dardanelles, those steel-blue waters that connect the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. Every single ship that wanted to reach the rich trading ports of the Black Sea had to pass right by your city. And here's the kicker. For weeks at a time, during sailing season, the north wind would blow so hard that ships literally couldn't move forward. They had to wait in Troy's harbor until the wind died down. The Trojans figured out they were sitting on a gold mine. They became the ultimate middlemen, getting rich off every merchant who got stuck waiting for better weather. Picture them as the ancient world's equivalent of airport shops. You're trapped there, so you might as well pay their prices. The only thing Troy really produced was horses. And let's be honest, horse dealers have never had the best reputation. The Trojans probably found ways to cheat customers that would make a used car salesman blush. But Troy's control over this crucial trade route went far deeper than simple extortion. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Trojans developed one of the ancient world's most sophisticated commercial systems. They didn't just charge ships to wait in their harbor, they provided banking services, insurance, repairs, supplies, and even security escorts for valuable cargoes. Think about it from a merchant's perspective. You're carrying a fortune in precious metals, exotic goods, and luxury items across hundreds of miles of dangerous water filled with pirates, storms, and hostile kingdoms. When you reach Troy, you don't just need a place to wait out bad weather, you need a secure fortress where you can store your goods, trusted bankers who can arrange payment to your business partners, skilled craftsmen who can repair your ships, and reliable guards who can protect your cargo from thieves. The Trojans provided all of these services, and they charged premium prices for every one of them. By 1200 BC, Troy had become something like a combination of Wall Street, Lloyd's of London, and Fort Knox all rolled into one. The city's wealth wasn't based on manufacturing or agriculture. It was based on controlling the flow of information, money, and goods between continents. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed just how incredibly wealthy Troy had become. The city's royal palace complex covered nearly 10 acres and included massive storage facilities filled with goods from across the known world. Archaeologists have found Chinese silk, Indian ivory, African gold, Scandinavian amber, and Spanish silver, all mixed together in Troy's ruins. This wasn't just a regional trading post. This was one of the economic nerve centers of the ancient world. But all that wealth came with a price. Troy was stuck between two empires that absolutely hated each other. To the east were the Hittites, master warriors who rode chariots out of the central highlands and controlled most of what we now call Turkey. To the west were the Greeks, and these weren't the philosophical Greeks you learned about in school. These were the Vikings of the Bronze Age. Chapter 2. The Hittites, Masters of the Ancient World. To understand the Trojan War, you need to understand the Hittites, because they were the real superpower of the Bronze Age world. While most people today have barely heard of them, the Hittites built one of history's first great empires, stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt. The Hittites were innovators in ways that would reshape warfare forever. They were the first people to master ironworking on a large scale, giving them weapons that could cut through bronze armor like paper. They developed new techniques for breeding and training horses, creating cavalry units that could outmaneuver any army in the world. They built massive fortified cities with walls so thick and tall that enemies would often surrender rather than attempt a siege. But the Hittites' greatest innovation was political. They created the world's first international law system, complete with written treaties, diplomatic immunity, and rules for conducting warfare. The Hittite royal archives, discovered in the early 20th century, contain hundreds of tablets documenting treaties with kingdoms across the ancient world. These weren't just non-aggression pacts, they were sophisticated agreements covering trade disputes, territorial boundaries, extradition of criminals, and even marriage alliances between royal families. For over 300 years, the Hittites maintained a careful balance of power with Egypt, the other great superpower of the ancient world. The two empires fought each other to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh around 1275 BC, then signed the world's first recorded peace treaty. Copies of this treaty, carved in stone, can still be seen today in both Turkey and Egypt. But the Hittites had one major weakness: geography. Their empire was centered in the highlands of central Anatolia, hundreds of miles from the sea. To maintain their wealth and power, they needed access to maritime trade routes, and the most important of those routes ran right past Troy. The relationship between Troy and the Hittites was complicated. Troy was technically independent, but it existed within the Hittite sphere of influence. Think of it like Switzerland during the Cold War, officially neutral, but clearly aligned with the Western powers. Troy paid tribute to the Hittite king, provided military support when requested, and followed Hittite foreign policy guidelines. In return, the Hittites guaranteed Troy's independence and provided military protection against outside threats. This arrangement worked perfectly for both sides. The Hittites got access to maritime trade without having to build and maintain a navy. Troy got the protection of the ancient world's most powerful military without giving up its profitable independence. For centuries, this partnership made both Troy and the Hittite Empire incredibly wealthy. But by 1200 BC, cracks were beginning to show in the Hittite Empire. Climate change was causing droughts across central Anatolia, leading to crop failures and famine. Barbarian tribes were pressing against the empire's northern borders, forcing the Hittites to keep large armies tied down far from the coast. Most dangerously, a new power was rising in the west that threatened to upset the entire balance of power in the region. The Greeks built some of history's first warships. They spread across the Mediterranean with one hand on the steering wheel and the other on a sword. When coastal peoples saw the bird-beak prows of Greek ships on the horizon, they knew trouble was coming. The Greeks conquered Crete, took over islands across the Aegean, and established footholds all along the coast of what's now Turkey. They were always looking for their next target, but calling them Greeks is actually misleading, because these people had almost nothing in common with the classical Greeks of later centuries. The Bronze Age Greeks, known to historians as the Mycenaeans, were a warrior culture that had more in common with medieval Vikings than with Plato and Aristotle. Mycenaean society was built around massive fortress palaces that dominated the landscape from hilltops across southern Greece. These weren't just royal residences, they were the nerve centers of militarized kingdoms that existed primarily for warfare and raiding. The palace at Pylos had storage rooms for over 2,000 sets of bronze armor. The fortress at Tiryns had walls so thick that later Greeks thought they must have been built by giants. The Mycenaean kings weren't philosophers or statesmen. They were warlords who measured their success in captured slaves, stolen gold, and conquered territories. Their tombs were filled with weapons, armor, and luxury goods taken from their enemies. The famous gold death mask that archaeologists found at Mycenae, which they initially thought belonged to Agamemnon himself, shows a face that looks exactly like what you'd expect from a Bronze Age warrior king: proud, ruthless, and absolutely terrifying. These warrior kings maintained their power through a feudal system that rewarded military service above all else. The palace archives from Pylos, written in an early form of Greek called Linear B, show a society organized entirely around warfare. Every adult male had a military rank and specific duties in case of attack. Every piece of land was held in exchange for military service. Even the craftsmen, who made pottery and jewelry, were organized into military units. But what made the Mycenaeans truly dangerous was their mastery of naval warfare. While other Bronze Age powers focused on land-based armies, the Greeks developed specialized warships designed for rapid coastal raids. These ships were built for speed and maneuverability rather than carrying capacity. They could appear off an enemy coast without warning, disgorge dozens of heavily armed warriors, and disappear again before defenders could mount an effective response. The Greeks perfected what military historians now call amphibious assault tactics. They would sail along an enemy coastline until they found a vulnerable target, usually a small town or an isolated farmstead. Then, they would beach their ships, overwhelm any local defenses through sheer violence and surprise, grab everything valuable they could carry, and sail away before enemy reinforcements could arrive. This hit-and-run strategy was incredibly effective against the more traditional armies of the time. Most Bronze Age warfare was based on formal battles between organized armies meeting on open plains. The Greeks didn't play by these rules. They struck without warning, avoided fair fights whenever possible, and disappeared back to the sea before their enemies could retaliate. Archaeological evidence shows that Greek raiders were active all across the eastern Mediterranean by 1200 BC. Egyptian records describe repeated attacks by sea peoples, who match the description of Mycenaean warriors. Hittite texts complain about Greek pirates disrupting trade routes. Even inland cities, hundreds of miles from the coast, show evidence of sudden, violent destruction that matches the Greek raiding pattern. The Greeks had another crucial advantage over their enemies. They weren't defending anything. The Hittites had to protect a vast empire, full of cities, trade routes, and agricultural areas. The Egyptians had to defend the entire Nile Valley and its crucial irrigation systems. The Trojans had to protect their city and its network of allied towns. But the Greeks were essentially nomadic warriors. Their fortress palaces back in Greece were defended by massive walls and natural barriers that made them almost impossible to attack. This meant that Greek war bands could range across the Mediterranean for months or even years at a time, striking targets of opportunity without worrying about retaliation against their homeland. By 1200 BC, Greek raiding had become so common and so destructive that it was destabilizing the entire eastern Mediterranean. The old system of Bronze Age diplomacy, based on negotiated treaties between settled kingdoms, simply couldn't cope with an enemy that refused to stay in one place or follow established rules of warfare. Western Anatolia, the region where Troy sat, was like being Poland caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. It was wealthy, cultured, and completely screwed. There were dozens of small kingdoms in the area, all fighting each other while the Greeks and Hittites pulled strings from the shadows. Wars broke out constantly, alliances shifted like sand, and through it all, Troy kept getting richer and more tempting to its enemies. Chapter 4. The World Before the Storm. Here's where the story gets really interesting. For decades, historians thought the Trojan War was just a myth. Sure, there might have been some conflict, but Homer's epic poems were clearly just fantasy, right? A 10-year siege, armies of over 100,000 men, gods walking around the battlefield. Come on. But this dismissive attitude was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how Bronze Age warfare actually worked. Modern historians, influenced by more recent examples of warfare, assumed that ancient battles must have followed similar patterns to World War I or World War II. Massive armies facing off in decisive campaigns that lasted for months or years. The reality of Bronze Age warfare was completely different. These conflicts were more like a combination of modern terrorism, organized crime, and corporate espionage than traditional military campaigns. Armies were small, usually numbering in the hundreds rather than the thousands. Battles were rare and usually lasted only a few hours. Most warfare consisted of raiding, sieges, and psychological warfare designed to exhaust the enemy rather than destroy them in direct combat. This helps explain why the Trojan War could have lasted 10 years without being the kind of massive, continuous military campaign that Homer describes. Bronze Age conflicts were typically long, drawn-out affairs, punctuated by brief periods of intense violence. Armies would clash, withdraw to lick their wounds, spend months or even years preparing for the next round, then clash again. To understand how this worked, we need to look at the economics of Bronze Age warfare. Maintaining an army was incredibly expensive. Bronze weapons and armor cost a fortune to manufacture and required constant maintenance. Horses and chariots needed specialized care and feeding. Warriors expected to be paid not just in food and shelter, but in shares of captured loot. Most importantly, Bronze Age armies couldn't live off the land the way later medieval armies could. The agricultural surplus of Bronze Age societies was tiny compared to what would be available in later centuries. A few hundred soldiers could easily eat a region into famine within a few months. This meant that armies had to be supplied by long, vulnerable baggage trains that were constantly targeted by enemy raiders. The result was that Bronze Age warfare followed a distinctive seasonal pattern. Armies would mobilize in late spring, campaign for a few months during the summer, then demobilize in the fall so that soldiers could return home to help with the harvest. Major campaigns were separated by years of preparation, negotiation, and smaller-scale raiding. This pattern helps explain many of the puzzling aspects of Homer's account. The 10-year duration of the war doesn't mean 10 years of constant fighting. It means 10 campaigning seasons spread out over a decade, with long periods of relative inactivity in between. The enormous army sizes Homer mentions probably refer to the total number of warriors involved over the entire course of the war, not the number present at any single battle. Even more importantly, this seasonal pattern of warfare meant that Bronze Age conflicts were as much about economics and politics as they were about military tactics. The side that could maintain its economic base while disrupting its enemy's trade and agriculture would eventually win, regardless of what happened in any particular battle. This is where Troy's strategic position becomes crucial to understanding the war. Troy wasn't just another Bronze Age city, it was the economic heart of an entire region. The city's wealth came from controlling maritime trade routes, but it also served as the financial and administrative center for dozens of smaller communities scattered across the Troad. Archaeological evidence shows that Troy operated what historians call a palatial economy, a centralized system where the royal palace controlled most economic activity in the region. Farmers brought their surplus crops to Troy's storehouses. Craftsmen worked in palace workshops using raw materials imported through Troy's trade networks. Merchants operated under licenses issued by Troy's bureaucrats. This meant that Troy wasn't just a city, it was the nerve center of an entire economic system. Destroying Troy wouldn't just eliminate one enemy fortress, it would collapse the entire regional economy and leave dozens of smaller communities defenseless and impoverished. For Greek raiders, this made Troy the ultimate target. A successful attack on Troy wouldn't just provide immediate loot, it would destroy the economic foundation of the entire region, making future raiding campaigns much easier. It was like knocking out the central bank, the stock exchange, and the main shipping port all at once. But attacking Troy also represented enormous risks for the Greeks. The city was heavily fortified and defended by professional soldiers using the best weapons and armor available. It was allied with the Hittite Empire, which meant that attacking Troy could potentially trigger a war with the most powerful military force in the known world. And Troy's wealth came partly from providing services to Greek merchants, which meant that destroying the city could damage Greek economic interests as much as enemy ones. For years, these risks probably outweighed the potential rewards. Greek war bands found plenty of easier targets to raid without taking on Troy directly. The Hittite Empire remained strong enough to deter major Greek aggression, and Troy's diplomatic skills allowed it to maintain profitable relationships with Greek merchants, even while providing military support to Greek enemies. But by 1200 BC, this delicate balance was beginning to collapse. Climate change was causing crop failures across the eastern Mediterranean, forcing more and more Greek warbands to turn to raiding for survival. The Hittite Empire was increasingly preoccupied with barbarian invasions from the north and couldn't provide reliable protection for its Western allies. Most crucially, Troy's own success had made it so wealthy that it represented an irresistible target for increasingly desperate Greek raiders. The stage was set for the most famous war in ancient history. But as we'll see, the conflict that followed was nothing like the epic battles Homer describes. Chapter 5. The Archaeological Revolution. But then archaeologists started digging, and everything changed. In 1871, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann shocked the world by announcing he'd found Troy. Schliemann was part genius, part fraud. He definitely found something important, but he also probably planted some of his discoveries to get more attention. Still, he got the ball rolling. Schliemann's story is almost as dramatic as the Trojan War itself. He was a self-made millionaire who had made his fortune in Russian trade and California gold mining before deciding to pursue his childhood dream of finding the lost city of Troy. Using Homer's descriptions as his guide, he identified a large mound called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey as the most likely site. When Schliemann began digging at Hisarlik in 1871, archaeology barely existed as a scientific discipline. There were no standardized excavation techniques, no systematic record-keeping, and no understanding of how to interpret layers of ancient debris. Schliemann essentially made up his methods as he went along, and his inexperience led to some catastrophic mistakes. Most famously, Schliemann was so eager to reach what he thought was Homer's Troy that he dug straight down through the mound, destroying several later layers of ancient occupation. When he found a cache of gold jewelry and precious objects, he immediately declared it Priam's treasure and smuggled it out of Turkey to be displayed in European museums. Later analysis showed that these objects actually dated from about 1,000 years before the Trojan War supposedly took place. But despite his amateur methods and questionable ethics, Schliemann made a genuinely revolutionary discovery. Hisarlik really was an ancient city, and it had been occupied continuously for over 3,000 years. More importantly, one of the occupation levels showed clear evidence of violent destruction around the right time period for the Trojan War. Schliemann's discoveries launched a gold rush of archaeological exploration across the eastern Mediterranean. Within a few decades, archaeologists had uncovered Bronze Age palaces in Greece, massive fortifications in Turkey, and treasure-filled tombs from Cyprus to Crete. For the first time, scholars could see what the Bronze Age world had actually looked like. The picture that emerged was radically different from what anyone had expected. Instead of the primitive, barbaric societies that historians had imagined, the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean turned out to have been a sophisticated network of wealthy kingdoms connected by extensive trade routes and diplomatic relationships. The palace at Knossos in Crete had indoor plumbing and frescoes that rivaled anything produced during the Renaissance. The fortress at Mycenae had been surrounded by massive stone walls built with engineering techniques that weren't equaled again until the Roman period. Most surprisingly, excavations revealed that these ancient civilizations had developed complex writing systems for keeping administrative records. The discovery of Linear B tablets at Pylos and other Greek sites was particularly shocking. When the script was finally deciphered in the 1950s, it turned out to be an early form of Greek used for palace administration. The tablets recorded everything from livestock inventories to military rosters to religious ceremonies. They showed that Bronze Age Greek society had been far more organized and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. But the most important archaeological discoveries were still to come. The real breakthrough came much later, starting in 1988. New excavations revealed something incredible. Troy wasn't the tiny fortress that archaeologists thought it was. This place was massive, about 75 acres, which made it one of the biggest cities in the Bronze Age world. We're talking about 5,000 to 7,500 people living there, which was huge for that time period. The new excavations at Troy were led by Manfred Kaufmann, a German archaeologist who brought modern scientific techniques to bear on Schliemann's old site. Using ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and systematic excavation methods, Kaufmann's team revealed that Troy had been much larger and more complex than anyone had previously understood. The Troy that Schliemann had found was just the citadel, the fortified palace complex at the center of a much larger urban area. Surrounding the citadel was a lower town protected by its own walls and ditches. Beyond that was an extensive network of suburbs, farmsteads, and satellite communities that extended for miles in all directions. This expanded Troy matched the scale of other major Bronze Age cities much better than Schliemann's small fortress had. With a population of several thousand people and control over an extensive rural territory, Troy really could have been the regional power that Homer describes. And here's the part that gave historians chills. Independent evidence from Hittite texts started mentioning Troy. The Hittites called it Tahuisa or Wilusa, and in early Greek, Ilion, Homer's name for Troy, was pronounced Willian. The pieces were falling into place. The Hittite archives, discovered at the ancient capital of Hattusa in central Turkey, contained dozens of references to a kingdom called Wilusa, located in northwestern Anatolia. The Hittite texts described Wilusa as an important ally that controlled crucial trade routes and provided military support for Hittite campaigns in the region. Even more exciting, the Hittite archives contained references to specific rulers of Wilusa whose names seemed to match characters from Homer's poems. One text mentions a king of Wilusa named Alexandru, which is remarkably similar to Alexander, the alternative name that Homer gives to Paris, the Trojan prince who supposedly started the war by eloping with Helen. Another Hittite text describes a conflict in which warriors from Ahiyawa, almost certainly the Hittite name for the Greek kingdoms, attacked cities in western Anatolia. The text is fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but it seems to describe exactly the kind of Greek raiding activity that Homer attributes to the early stages of the Trojan War. These discoveries revolutionized scholarly attitudes toward the historicity of the Trojan War. While most historians still didn't accept Homer's account as literally accurate, the growing archaeological evidence made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the poems as pure fantasy. But wait, it gets even better. The new archaeological evidence showed that around 1200 BC, right when Homer said the Trojan War happened, Troy was destroyed by fire. Not just any fire, but a raging inferno that consumed the entire city. Archaeologists found arrowheads, spearheads, sling stones, and unburied human bones scattered throughout the ruins. This wasn't a city that gradually declined. This was a city that got sacked. The destruction layer at Troy 7a, the archaeological level that corresponds to Homer's Troy, tells a story of sudden, violent attack. The fire that consumed the city was so intense that it melted bronze objects and fused pottery shards to stone walls. Bodies were found lying in the streets where they had fallen, apparently caught by the flames while trying to flee. Most tellingly, The distribution of weapons and military equipment in the destruction layer suggests that the city fell to a surprise attack rather than a prolonged siege. Arrowheads and spear points are scattered throughout residential areas, indicating that fighting took place in the streets rather than just along the city walls. This pattern is consistent with Homer's account of Greek warriors infiltrating the city through trickery rather than breaking through its defenses by brute force. Now, some skeptics pointed out that Troy didn't have as many weapons lying around as other destroyed cities. But think about it, Troy became the ancient world's #1 tourist destination. Everyone from Alexander the Great to Roman emperors came to see the ruins of the famous city. They dug up the place, looking for souvenirs. Later, builders flattened parts of the site to build temples. Of course, there isn't as much stuff left lying around. The site's later history actually supports the identification with Homer's Troy rather than undermining it. If this had been just another anonymous Bronze Age settlement, there would have been no reason for later visitors to disturb the ruins. The fact that the site was continuously looted and rebuilt suggests that people in the ancient world really did believe this was the location of the famous war. Archaeological evidence for this later activity is extensive. Roman tourists left graffiti scratched into ancient walls. Byzantine churches were built using stones from Bronze Age fortifications. Ottoman-era buildings incorporated architectural elements from multiple historical periods. The entire site is a palimpsest of different civilizations, all drawn to this location by the fame of the Trojan War. So we know Troy was real, we know it was destroyed violently around the right time, and we know it was important enough for the Hittites to write about. But was the war really fought the way Homer described it? Chapter 6. The Real Art of Bronze Age War. This is where modern archaeology delivers its biggest surprise. The Trojan War wasn't anything like the epic battles described in the Iliad. There was no massive siege with armies facing off across a plain. There weren't heroic duels between champions while everyone else watched. The real Trojan War was something much sneakier and more brutal. To understand what Bronze Age warfare was really like, we need to forget everything we think we know about ancient battles. Hollywood movies and popular books have given us a completely false picture of how Bronze Age armies fought. The reality was much stranger, more complex, and more vicious than anything Hollywood has ever imagined. First, Bronze Age armies were tiny by later standards. While Homer talks about armies of 100,000 men, the reality is that most Bronze Age kingdoms couldn't field more than a few hundred warriors at a time. The entire population of Bronze Age Greece probably numbered less than 100,000 people, which means that an army of 100,000 warriors would have required every single man, woman, and child in the country to be a soldier. Even the largest Bronze Age battles involved armies numbering in the low thousands at most. The Battle of Kadesh, fought between the Hittites and Egyptians around 1275 BC, was probably the largest military engagement of the Bronze Age, and modern estimates suggest that each side fielded between 2,000 and 5,000 warriors. This small scale of Bronze Age warfare was partly due to limitations in weapons and armor production. Bronze is a relatively rare metal that requires sophisticated metallurgy to produce properly. A single bronze sword represented weeks of work by skilled craftsmen, using expensive raw materials imported from hundreds of miles away. Only wealthy aristocrats could afford to equip themselves with full sets of bronze weapons and armor. Most Bronze Age warriors fought with weapons that would seem primitive by later standards. Spears were more common than swords because they required less metal to manufacture. Bows were often made from simple wood, rather than the composite materials used by later armies. Body armor was rare and usually consisted of leather reinforced with bronze plates, rather than the full bronze cuirasses worn by elite warriors. This equipment scarcity meant that Bronze Age armies were essentially collections of individual warriors rather than disciplined military units. Each fighter was responsible for providing his own weapons, armor, and supplies. There was no standardized training, no uniform equipment, and no formal chain of command below the level of the king or war leader. Combat itself was more like a series of individual duels than a coordinated battle. Warriors would advance toward the enemy line, challenge specific opponents to single combat, fight until one side or the other was killed or wounded, then withdraw to rest while other warriors took their turn. This pattern explains why Homer spends so much time describing individual combats between named heroes rather than large-scale tactical maneuvers. The result was that Bronze Age battles were usually decided by psychological factors rather than tactical superiority. The side whose warriors lost their nerve first would break and run, often with minimal actual casualties on either side. Most of the killing happened during the pursuit of fleeing enemies rather than during the main battle. This helps explain why Bronze Age conflicts could continue for years or even decades without producing decisive results. Armies would meet, fight a brief engagement, then withdraw to prepare for the next encounter. Neither side had the military technology or organizational capacity to completely destroy their enemies in a single campaign. Picture this instead. The war was more like modern terrorism than World War II. The Greeks didn't try to surround Troy and starve it out. They couldn't. Troy was too well defended and had too many allies. Instead, the Greeks used hit-and-run tactics. They'd sail up to the coast, raid a town or village, steal everything valuable, capture women and children as slaves, then sail away before Troy's army could respond. This pattern of raiding warfare was perfectly adapted to the strengths and weaknesses of Bronze Age military technology. Greek ships gave them strategic mobility that land-based armies couldn't match. They could strike anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline, then disappear back to the sea before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The Troad, Troy's territory, had 28 towns and villages scattered across the countryside. None of these places had walls like the main city. They were sitting ducks. The Greeks would strike fast, grab what they could, and disappear. It was psychological warfare, designed to slowly bleed Troy dry. Each of these raids followed a similar pattern. Greek ships would appear off the coast at dawn, usually targeting isolated fishing villages or farming communities. The raiders would beach their ships, overwhelm any local defenses through sheer surprise and violence, then systematically loot everything valuable they could carry. The primary targets were people rather than property. Captured prisoners could be sold as slaves in Greek markets, providing immediate profit from each raid. Young women and children were particularly valuable because they could be easily transported and were less likely to attempt escape during the voyage back to Greece. But the Greeks also targeted the economic infrastructure that supported Troy's wealth. They would destroy fishing boats, burn granaries, slaughter livestock, and demolish workshops. The goal wasn't just to steal valuable goods, it was to systematically undermine the economic foundation of Troy's power. This strategy was devastatingly effective against the kind of centralized palatial economy that Troy represented. Bronze Age kingdoms depended on a steady flow of tribute and taxes from rural communities to support their urban populations and military forces. By disrupting this flow of resources, Greek raiders could weaken Troy without ever having to attack the main city directly. The psychological impact of these raids was probably even more important than their economic effects. Rural communities throughout the Troad lived in constant fear of Greek attack. Farmers couldn't work their fields without armed guards. Fishing boats couldn't venture far from shore. Trade caravans required military escorts that drained Troy's military resources. This climate of fear and uncertainty made it increasingly difficult for Troy to maintain its network of allies and tributary states. Local rulers who had previously supported Troy began to question whether the city could really protect them from Greek raiders. Some probably began paying tribute to Greek warbands to avoid being attacked. This explains why Homer says the war lasted 10 years. It wasn't 10 years of constant fighting. It was 10 years of occasional raids, punctuated by long periods where nothing much happened. The Greeks would strike, retreat to their ships, then maybe hit a different target weeks or months later. They were patient predators, slowly wearing down their prey. The Greeks had several safe bases from which they could launch these attacks. The island of Tenedos, located just off the Trojan coast, provided an ideal staging area for raids into the Troad. Greek settlements on the nearby islands of Lesbos and Lemnos offered secure harbors where raiding fleets could resupply and repair their ships. Most importantly, the Greeks had established footholds along the Anatolian coast that could serve as forward bases for extended campaigns. Archaeological evidence suggests that Greek communities existed at several locations along what is now the Turkish coast, probably founded by earlier waves of raiders who had decided to settle down and establish permanent colonies. These forward bases allowed Greek warbands to maintain pressure on Troy year-round rather than just during the normal campaigning season. Small groups of raiders could spend the winter in coastal strongholds, then launch surprise attacks when Troy's defenses were expecting a period of relative peace. And Troy couldn't really fight back effectively. Sure, they had a strong army and good walls, but their strength was in defense. The Greeks had strategic mobility. They could appear anywhere along the coast, strike, and vanish. Troy's forces would always be one step behind, rushing to defend places that had already been hit. Troy's military organization was designed for a completely different kind of warfare. The city's army was built around heavy infantry and chariot-based cavalry units that excelled in formal battles on open plains. These forces were devastating when they could catch enemy armies in direct combat, but they were poorly suited for chasing down mobile raiders.